All right, well, 7 o'clock, I think we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome everybody who is tuning in. This is our second lecture of the series this spring. My name is Scott Newbold. I'm a member of the biology faculty here at Sheridan College, and I help coordinate the lecture series that's run out of the Sheridan College Museum of Discovery. And for roughly 2 decades, we've been bringing in local and regional speakers and feel fortunate to be able to do that with the support from the Sheridan College Foundation and the Life Science Department at the college. It's my pleasure to introduce Michael Dillon tonight. He is an associate professor in the Department of Zoology and Physiology at UW, and until maybe very recently was the director of the UW-NPS Research Station in Grand Teton National Park. His education and training include a bachelor's in zoology from the University of Texas, Austin, and a PhD in biology from the University of Washington. Before joining UW in 2009, he served as an NSF postdoctoral fellow in the Department of Integrative Biology at UC Berkeley. Michael has studied the physiology and ecology of insects, particularly bees, which we'll hear about tonight, for over 20 years across the Western US, in China, and Central and South America. His students currently work on a diverse range of topics, including distribution of threatened bees, effects of whim farms on insects, flight and thermal physiology of bumblebees, and overwintering of native bees. He recently published a field guide to the native bees of Wyoming with UW colleague Lusha Tronstad, aimed at engaging the public in understanding, appreciating, and protecting our native bee fauna. And so I've got a couple of those guides here. Michael was generous enough to send these our way. And so I have a few more to hand out if people are interested in those. And I'm sure he can tell you where you can get more from the source at the Biodiversity Institute. So at the end of tonight's lecture, Michael would be happy to take Q&A questions. And so as we're going through, or towards the end, if you want to submit questions into the Q&A box, which you'll find at the bottom of your screen, you can do that, and then Michael can address those at the end of the talk. That would be great. So with that, I'll introduce Michael. He's here to talk about a bug's life at extremes, how the humble bee thrives from deserts to mountaintops. Thanks,
Great.
Michael.
Thank you, Scott, and thank you for those of you who are able to make it tonight. Real pleasure to be able to talk to a broader audience about some of the stuff that I spend my time thinking about. So what I wanted to do tonight is just kind of walk through some stories about this animal that is, as Scott mentioned, I've been thinking about and studying for almost 20 years, I guess over 20 years now. And this is the bumblebee. Is mostly what you probably think of it as. I like the term hummingbird, which is an older name for this animal. And I'll come back to why it is I like that term here in a minute. Many of you may recognize this view. This is Jackson Lake in Grand Teton National Park, looking across at the Tetons. As Scott mentioned, we have a field station there that I directed until recently. It's an amazing, spectacular place. And more to the point for this talk, there's lots and lots of bumblebees, even on the tops of these high mountains. And so we find bumblebees or hummingbees in these cold mountaintop regions that are relatively inhospitable to lots of other animals. But we can also go to deserts in sort of Arizona, Southern California that are extremely hot and dry, and we find lots of bumblebees there as well. So these animals are able to survive in very diverse climates, not just within the US, but across the world. I think what's particularly fun about these animals is that you all probably know them very well. So if you go into your backyard or you hike in the mountains at all, you see these things on flowers. And bumble suggests that they bumble around in their sort of pollination, and humble suggests that, again, they're very humble animals. And they're wonderful animals to work with. But one of the amazing things about them, from my perspective, is that you can find them in your garden, but also you can find them all over the world in really interesting and extreme places. And that fascinates me in terms of thinking about how does organisms deal with the challenges of life at extremes. But I want to back up before I talk about bumblebees and give you a little perspective on my personal experience that led to me studying these creatures in these climates. And that kind of goes back to, I was fortunate enough to work as part of a team looking at hummingbird flight physiology and thermal physiology in the Peruvian Andes. So I'm standing here at a pass at about 4,500, 5,000 meters. So, on the order of 15,000 feet. And working with a group of people led by my colleague, Doug Altschuler, who's now at UBC in Vancouver. That's me many, many years ago. And we had Earthwatch teams that worked with us in these high mountains to collect hummingbirds and mist nets, and then bring them back to our makeshift lab in the field to study characteristics of these animals that allowed them to live at 5,000, 6,000 meters in the Andes. And so this is a really important experience for me. I loved hanging out in these high places, but one of the things that happens when you're trying to work in these high places, getting up early to set nets, chasing down these animals, running back to the labs, is you quickly realize that living in mountains is tough. So one of my colleagues caught me taking a nap in between mist net runs. So when you're at high elevations, it's really challenging to be up there. And I started to think a lot about the physiological challenges associated with these places and how organisms might deal with them. So to put this in a perspective I think you guys are all familiar with, I started thinking about, okay, I was working on hummingbirds and I thought, but I want to work with an animal that I can do more things with and that is also uniquely positioned to let me answer these questions about extreme environments. And so in doing lots of reading and talking with lots of people at that time, I really sort of stumbled across these guys, these bumblebees, and found a really neat pattern. So Paul Williams at the Natural History Museum in London, who's really the world's expert on bumblebees, we started communicating. He shared this figure with me. And so this is, of course, a world map. And the colors and numbers indicate the numbers of species of bumblebees found in these regions in different parts of the world. So cold colors, blues, and low numbers indicate few species, and warm colors, high numbers, indicate lots of species. And so when you first see this, it's like, oh, this is neat. It varies. But as a biologist, the thing that stuck out to me sticks out really clearly when you just look at a topographic map of the world. So if you look at where mountains are in the world, I hope you see that where there are mountains, bumblebees are quite diverse. There's high species diversity of these organisms. So we look at those Peruvian Andes that I was hanging out in. We're looking at 12 to 15 species of bumblebees. In the neighboring Amazon, there's only 2. So this is fascinating from a biological perspective because that is not the pattern you see for most other organisms. Most organisms are super diverse in lowland rainforests, tropical places, and less diverse in the neighboring mountains. Bumblebees show just the opposite. So lots of bumblebee species in the Andes, lots of bumblebee species in the Rocky Mountains around here. That includes this area. Lots of bumblebee species in mountains in Europe and in Northern Asia. And focus the really highest diversity of bumblebee species here in Western China. Over 70 species of bumblebees in this small area in Sichuan, where the Tibetan Plateau sort of falls off into Western China in this Himalayan mountain range. And so I, of course, said, well, I got to go to the source. I got to go right to this spot where the diversity is highest if I want to study how these animals do well in these areas. So bumblebees thrive in these areas. Let's go there and figure out what they're doing and how they're doing it. And so I did. So I coordinated with colleagues in Western China, Sichuan University. And here I am standing on a pass. This is Rilong Pass. It's at about 4,800 meters. So again, we're at about 15,000 feet at the pass. Okay, so we're standing at a spot that's higher than any location in Wyoming, and we're looking across at mountains that are another 6,000 feet higher than where we are. So these are the Four Sisters Mountains, Siguniangshang, and these range from about 6,000 to 7,000 meters in height. So an extremely interesting place, crazy place to hang out. We're in the middle of summer. These are my colleagues there, and it's the hottest time of the year, and we're in sweaters and winter gear because it's quite cold at these high elevations. But despite those extreme conditions, if you turn around and look the other way from these mountains, this is what you see. So there's these beautiful ridges and valleys that are just packed with all kinds of interesting flowers. And where there are flowers, there are bees. And in particular, there are bumblebees. So We spent many, many days looking for bees. I was convinced we would find them here, and we couldn't find them. We couldn't find them. We started to get discouraged. And then we realized that it was so cold that they just didn't stop for long. And so they're zipping between flowers, and we had to basically listen for them to locate them so that we could be able to start catching them. Once we figured that out, it turns out there are many, many species and individuals of bumblebees in these high places, even up above 5,500 and 6,000 meters. So super high location to find these animals. And us running around in those conditions, trying to chase down these animals, made us, drove home the point again, that it's tough to live in these places. Life is tough in cold, thin air. So I want to again bring this back to people. I think we're aware of these things, and then I'll come back to bumblebees and think about what are the challenges for them. So I'm going to use an extreme example, of course, highest peak on Earth, Everest. Many of you are probably familiar with it. One of the first challenges we think of when we see a high mountain like this is cold, right? And we're aware that cold has consequences. This is, of course, the famous story of Beck Weathers back in the 96 disaster. He got stuck out on the mountain. He managed to survive, but the cold took its toll. He lost a lot of tissue from his hands and feet and face because of frostbite, because of these cold conditions. Now that's a really extreme case, but even when you're not on the top of Everest, low temperatures limit life. When it's cold, it is harder and harder for diverse organisms, animals and plants, to live in those locations. So we know low temperatures matter when we're up high. The second thing that we're all familiar with, if you hike at all in the mountains in Wyoming or elsewhere, we immediately think about oxygen. I've highlighted these two individuals who you may be familiar with. This is Reinhold Messner and Peter Habeler, the first people to solo Everest without supplemental oxygen. This is 1978. This was a huge feat, right? Because you get to the top of Everest and oxygen is at about a third the value that it is at sea level. So for organisms like us and like insects and other animals that depend on oxygen to fuel life, when you reduce oxygen to those levels, it becomes very difficult to be there. I think one of my favorite quotes that they have regarding this is this quote that, I am nothing more than a single narrow gasping lung floating over the mists and summits. So they get to the top of this mountain without oxygen, and all they can think about is, how do I get oxygen into my tissues? Okay, so for even when you're not at these extreme altitudes of top of Everest, low oxygen challenges metabolism, which is a problem for any organism that is oxygen dependent. Now, those are two that we're all very familiar with. There's a third one that we don't think about as much, and it's because, unfortunately, I wish this wasn't the case, but we don't fly. And so for organisms that have to fly, to produce forces, the thin air or low air density at high elevations challenges their ability to do so. So flying organisms, they have to push down on molecules of air to create forces, upward forces that hold them aloft. And if you have fewer molecules, reduced air density, that's harder to do. Now, from a human perspective, we don't fly, so we're not quite aware of that, but we are in terms of our built flying devices like helicopters. It was a while before they were able to design helicopters that were stripped down versions that could actually go to high elevations to rescue people at these extreme places where they might get injured and they needed an airlift out. So low air density challenges flight as well. So we have temperatures, we have oxygen, we have low air density. And so given these challenges, I started to think a lot about, well, how is it that these animals that we're chasing around at 5,000, 6,000 meters in the mountains, how are they dealing with these challenges? So I want to first tackle this low air density one. And I want to come back to what the problem is. So this is some high-speed video taken by a former student, Chris Petranek. And what you're going to see here pretty soon, a bee come into view. And this is just a stream of smoke coming down from above so that we can better visualize what that bee is doing to that smoke, to the air around it, essentially. And so hopefully you see that this bee is flapping its wings back and forth, almost like it's treading water. And in so doing, it's pushing air down. And that action of pushing air down is lifting it up, right? So that's how it's creating flight forces. So you can imagine if you reduce the number of molecules, you have lower air density, it's harder to produce those forces. So one of the first questions I want to ask is simply, does this low air density we see, is it limiting bumblebees' ability to fly in these high elevations and therefore limiting where we find these animals? And so to address this question, we went out to one of these sites and with colleagues, including Robert Dudley at UC Berkeley, we essentially captured bees from these sites and put them into this chambers that I built, little flight chambers, in which we could manipulate total pressure and therefore air density that these animals are experiencing and ask whether or not they can fly. So when we did this the first year we went out, this is kind of what we got. So on the first, I'm going to show you a video of a bee that we caught. We put it in a chamber, and then we actually added air to that chamber to move it to a lower elevation and asked what it did when it was flying. When we did this, you'll see this bee flying around in this chamber, no problem. This is not a big deal. It can easily fly at this equivalent or simulated elevation. So then what we did is we took the same bee after a rest and said, okay, let's pump a bunch of air out of the chamber and ask if this bee still can fly. And if we do that repeatedly, we can figure out what's the maximum flight limit for this animal. So here we are, we've pumped air out of the chamber such that we've reached an equivalent altitude of 20,000 feet. And here's that same bee. You'll notice, first of all, that she kind of just walks around for a little bit. So they kind of get adjusted to these conditions. And we thought, okay, this animal can't fly here. We're going to discover. And then she took off. In fact, in all of these cases, the first time we did this, the chamber broke before we could get the bees to fail, which is why I went and built essentially the equivalent of Alvin for the second year. 1 inch thick plexiglass with rubber gaskets, et cetera, so we could actually get pressures low enough to cause these animals to fail. And so what does that look like when we look at a bunch of animals and ask where they fail? So here's some data from those experiments. So the blue dots here are indicating the highest elevation, equivalent elevation or altitude at which an individual bee was able to fly. In other words, it took off and was able to hover. The red is the lowest elevation at which it failed. Okay, so in between there, we're taking as sort of the maximum possible flight elevation for these animals. And you'll see that on average across all animals, they can fly at the equivalent of 8,000 meters. So all of these bees we tested could summit all 14 8,000 meter peaks on Earth by flying. 2 of them actually exceeded 9,000 meters before we could get them to fail. Everest is 8848. So to put this in perspective, this is at about 30,000 feet. So these bees are capable of generating sufficient lift for flight, equivalent to elevations that commercial airliners fly at. So they certainly can summit Everest, and it certainly seems that air density itself is not limiting for these animals. They have an incredible capacity to fly in extremely low air densities. And so the next question was, well, how do they do it? This is pretty remarkable. So to answer that question, we know it has something to do with the way they move their wings. So I'm going to talk about 2 main factors that really describe a lot of what we know about how animals move their wings. One is, if you look at this bee from the top, and you can see a side view of this animal in a mirror, I want you to notice that it's flapping its wings back and forth rapidly. In fact, it's doing it at about 200 times a second, 200 to 250 times a second. That is the wing beat frequency. So if we think back to that analogy of treading water, if you imagine you move your arms back and forth more quickly, you're pushing more molecules down per unit time, and therefore you're offsetting your mass and creating lift. So if you can flap your wings more quickly or increase wing beat frequency, that would be one solution to this problem. We didn't think that was how they're going to solve it, and I'll explain why here in a minute. The alternative thing they can do is change the angle through which they move their wings. So again, if you look at the forwardmost point of the wing and the backwardmost point of the wing, that angle describes what we call the stroke amplitude. It's just the angular extent of wing motion. So you can imagine if you flapped your wings this way, you're not pushing down much air, but if you flap them through a huge angle, you're pushing a lot of air down. So by changing stroke amplitude, increasing stroke amplitude, we hypothesized that might be the way they're doing this. And so we measured these characteristics for a whole bunch of bees that we had actually exposed to these conditions. And when we did that, this is what we found. So just like we predicted, they're increasing stroke amplitude. So on the left here is what the wing positions look like for a bee hovering at the equivalent of 3,200 meters roughly. And so that's how far forward the wing goes, and this is how far back the wing goes, and we can measure this angle, and that is the stroke amplitude. On the right, what I've depicted here is what those wings look like when they're flying at over 8,000 meters. And what you see is on the wings go this far forward and this far back, and I've overlaid the normal, the 3,250 in green here, and you can see that they're going through a wider stroke amplitude. So it turns out they increase stroke amplitude and they don't change wing beat frequency. So I'm not showing those data, but there's no change in that frequency. So why might they not change frequency? So I have to tell you a little bit about the internal workings of these animals. And so I want to do that by showing you this really nice animation of an insect thorax. And so the thorax is simply this spot on the bee that houses the flight muscles and to which the wings are connected. Now, bumblebee and other insect flight muscle does not work like your muscles. In other words, you don't have an attachment on a bone in two places, and when that muscle flexes, it causes the bone to move. That's a direct muscle attachment. There are no muscles attached to the wings of this bee. The wings are actually attached via complex structures to the thorax itself, which houses the muscle. And so if you look at this, the wings are cut off here, but you'll see a flappy structure here when I start this video again. That is where those wings attach, and you can see that there's a very complicated joint structure there that moves when the thorax flexes. So you can kind of see that in here. There's where the wings are attached. Now, if we zoom in and look at the muscles, they have two sets of muscles. They have muscles going from top to bottom and from front to back. And what they have is essentially like a closed container, and those muscles cause that container to flex. And those muscles work in exact opposition to each other. So they set that container, that thorax, oscillating at a resonant frequency. And so the structure of the thorax and the mass of the thorax, a bit like a tuning fork, determines the frequency at which that thorax oscillates. And all that happens then is the oscillations of the thorax are transmitted through that interesting joint to make the wings move. And so this is a really neat way to be able to get things to move really quickly and exceed the sort of normal capacity for the rate at which muscles can oscillate. So there are insects, for example, that have wing beat frequencies over 1,000 hertz, over 1,000 times per second they beat their wings. And it's partly because of this mechanism. The downside to this mechanism is it's very difficult to change the frequency away from that resonant frequency, that tuning fork. You know, if you got an F, it doesn't matter what you do, it's still going to be an F, right? You can't make it into a G. And so we think that that energetic cost of changing that frequency is why they don't change wing beat frequency, but rather change stroke amplitude. But that's kind of like looking at individual animals, and it's looking at one aspect of how they may deal with high elevation. I want to look at a second bit that I think should make intuitive sense to you. If we look at highly maneuverable type flyers like hummingbirds and fighter jets, right? These flyers tend to have small wings relative to their bodies, and they're not particularly fuel efficient. So this hummingbird needs to feed about every 20 minutes, otherwise it dies. And we know that fighter jets don't really have high fuel efficiency, right? But they're highly maneuverable and they can do amazing things. Hummingbirds can fly backwards and upside down and through rain and through tiny little holes, amazing flyers. So they've traded off efficiency for maneuverability and speed. Conversely, you have something like an albatross or an ultralight. So they have very large wings relative to body size, not particularly maneuverable. Don't ask this albatross to turn quickly, right? But the energetic costs of flight are quite low. So this thing can soar for hours, days at a time with very little energetic expenditure, in part because of the fact that it has such large wings relative to its body size. So thinking about the energetic costs of altitude, one of the hypotheses is that bees that live at high altitudes may be more like albatrosses than they are like hummingbirds, as they may have larger wings relative to their body size, such that they have lower relative energetic costs. So this is a hypothesis that we've tested multiple ways. I'm going to show you a couple of those ways. This is a bunch of data across Bumblebee species collected in Yosemite National Park. And what I'm showing here is our way of measuring that relationship between body size and wing area. So if you have high wing loading, that means you have a large body size relative to your wings. Your wings are heavily loaded with mass. If you have low wing loading, it means you have relatively large wings for your body size. And we see exactly the pattern we'd expect. If you're a bumblebee collected from a high elevation, 4,000 meters in this case, you tend to have low wing loading, meaning you have much larger wings from your body size than a bumblebee that's collected from low elevation. In other words, you're more like an albatross out here, more like a hummingbird at low elevations. We can test this in a slightly different way too with some other species. So this is a former undergraduate in my lab who did a bunch of nice work as an undergrad here. And we went out and collected all across the west coast of the US this species of bumblebee and measured the same sort of thing in a much more rigorous way. And we found the same pattern. Once you get above about 2,000 meters, wing loading declines. And again, that means that if you're at high elevation, you have larger wings relative to your body size. So we thought this was really exciting. So they basically have this morphological change, the structure of the wings, the size of the wings, combined with these sort of kinematic changes, looking at stroke amplitude, like I already mentioned. And so one of the things Zach was interested in is whether or not these changes were preserved or evolved among populations, or whether they were just a response to local conditions. And so to test that idea, we collaborated with a colleague, Jamie Strange, who's now at Ohio State University, went back out to some sites in Oregon, and we collected queens. Now, as many of you know, bumblebees, like honeybees, are social. So colonies are formed of a queen and a bunch of workers, all of whom are sisters. So we collected queens in the field from a low elevation spot and a nearby high elevation spot. We brought those queens, this time of this species called Vosnesenskii, brought them into the lab, and we started colonies from those queens. So here's one of those colonies. So here's the queen bee, and here are all of her offspring, which are all sisters, and they're rearing their own sisters. So these colonies can get up to about 300, 400 individuals, much smaller than a honeybee colony, but fairly large colonies. And then we can actually measure characteristics of the workers that are the offspring of queens that we collected in the field. And these workers that we rear in the lab are reared right next to each other upstairs in our bee room. So everything that they experience is exactly the same. The only thing that's different between them is their moms. And we can do the same thing. We can measure wing beat characteristics and wing morphology, just like I've already shown you. And when Zach did this, he found a really neat pattern. So here what I'm showing you is the wing beat frequency. That's how fast they beat their wings as a function of the wing loading. That is, how big are their wings relative to their body size. So again, if you have low wing loading, you have relatively small mass and large wings, and your wing beat frequency tends to be a little lower. And if you have high wing loading, you tend to have a slightly higher wing beat frequency. Okay, that wasn't a surprise. We expected that. The cool thing about this is that if we look at animals that he measured that were reared from queens collected at low elevation, that's these red points, they look very different morphologically, well, in terms of wing beat frequency, than do the workers reared from queens collected at high elevation. So even though they have the same wing loading, right, they're all in this range of 14 to 16 or whatever, the wing beat frequency of these workers is greatly reduced relative to those from low elevation. And so we think this is really compelling evidence, because of the energetic cost of wing beat frequency, that these high elevation bees have actually evolved an alternative way to move their wings such that they can operate at a lower wing beat frequency and save energy when they're flying at high elevations. So cool result that Zach found. I don't think that we know of any other study of a evolution of kinematics like this in any organism. So cool project for an undergrad to complete. So hopefully I showed you that, bumblebees have this remarkable capacity to fly in thin air. What about oxygen availability? Okay, so they can deal with air density. What about oxygen? So to put this in perspective, I want to kind of give you an idea of what are the oxygen demands of a flying bumblebee. So we can take a sort of regular non-athlete and ask them to lift weights, and their oxygen demand is around 45 mils of oxygen per kilogram of body mass per minute. Okay, just to put this in perspective. If we take an elite athlete like a cyclist or a Nordic skier, their oxygen demand is double that during athletic activity, more like 90 mils of oxygen per kilogram per minute. If we look at an elite animal athlete that we're all familiar with, pronghorn, we find that a running pronghorn is at more than threefold that of a Nordic skier in terms of oxygen demand. And so we think that's pretty impressive, but by far not the most impressive of sort of vertebrate athletes. If we look at a hovering hummingbird, it's closer to 700 mils of oxygen per kilogram per minute. So huge oxygen demand for these animals. But that still doesn't compare to the oxygen demand of a hovering bumblebee. Almost double that of a hummingbird and more than tenfold that of a Nordic athlete. Okay, so hovering bumblebees have ridiculous oxygen demands, and yet they're hanging out in high elevation places where there's very little oxygen to supply that demand. And so the question is, does low oxygen at elevation actually restrict their ability to live there? And there's reason to think it could. So these are data from humans, and this is just VO2 max. So measured for climbers as they're ascending Everest, essentially, as they're going from home places to Everest. And what we see is that VO2 max falls to about a quarter of its value at sea level once these climbers summit Everest. So their ability to deliver oxygen is a fourth what it was when they were at sea level, which is a phenomenal drop. And so if the same thing is happening for these bumblebees, we expect they won't be able to make it. So I had a great student who studied this, was really interested in oxygen limitations. Rather than show you a bunch of data because it all points to the same conclusion, I'm just going to tell you the take home. Bumblebees in these experiments where we can actually manipulate the oxygen in the air independent of temperature and air density, so only oxygen's changing, they can sustain hovering down to 5 kPa of oxygen. That's a partial pressure of oxygen. Put that in perspective, that's equivalent to an elevation of about 35,000 feet. So once again, these animals are capable of supplying oxygen at rates that are just unheard of for other organisms and could theoretically deal with oxygen that you would find above the sort of cruising altitude of a commercial airliner. How do they do it? Well, we have a little bit of an idea how they do it. We're still actively studying this. I think it's a phenomenal finding. One thing to recognize is that bees and other insects don't breathe the way you and I breathe. So we have lungs, we bring gases in, we exchange gases into our bloodstream and use a circulatory system to then distribute those gases throughout the body, oxygen in particular, to tissues. Insects have a tracheal system. So they essentially have openings to the outside called spiracles. Those openings connect directly to all these tubes and air sacs. And eventually, if you zoom down far enough, they end in tiny, tiny little openings that sit right next to the mitochondria, which is the place where energy is created for the cell from oxygen, right at the cellular level. So there's a direct connection from the atmosphere to the cell. So that tracheal system in part is probably what facilitates that. But the second thing that people have found recently that I think is really exciting is took advantage of an odd piece of laboratory equipment for somebody who studies insects. This is the Argonne National Lab's synchrotron facility. So this is a particle accelerator, normally used for things like nuclear physics. Some clever scientists realized that they could point one of these beams at an insect and get really amazing pictures of the internal structures and morphology of these insects. And you can see all these tracheal tubes. This is from one of those images. And they could even get movies of these insects as they were actively breathing. And when they did that, what they found is that not only do you have this tracheal system, but unlike what we previously thought, this is not a rigid system. This tracheal system is flexing. So those tubes here, these are tracheal tubes. The CO2 being breathed out by these animals varies directly with how often they're squeezing these tubes open and closed. So they're actually actively ventilating through the tracheal system, which is already a really good system to deliver oxygen. So these are two clues to how it is that they might be able to sustain these ridiculous oxygen consumption levels, even in low oxygen conditions. So hopefully I showed they're not limited by oxygen availability. They can fly in thin air. So what does limit them? Well, let's go to temperature. That was the first thing I mentioned. Bumblebees are really unique insects in the sense that they're actually heterotherms. That is, they regulate high body temperatures. So this is a thermal video of bumblebees feeding from flowers. Cold temperatures are indicated in blue and hot in red. So you can see these bumblebees flying around are actually very warm when they're foraging. In fact, Bumblebees have to be roughly 95 degrees Fahrenheit before they even take off. And when they're flying around foraging, they're hotter than you and I. They're closer to 102, 105 degrees Fahrenheit when they're flying around. So they're excellent regulators of body temperature. And many people would argue that means, well, that means they don't have to deal with these challenges of low temperatures. They just regulate high body temperatures. Well, two counter arguments to that. First of all, it's expensive. If you want to regulate high temperatures, it takes a lot of energy. It helps that they eat sugar, so that facilitates it. But the second thing is that even if you're a good thermoregulator, you have to deal with thermal limits. And so to put this in perspective, right, we are excellent thermoregulators, and yet we can get too hot. We can have fever, or more formally pyrexia, and eventually die because of heat stroke. We can get too cold. We get cold enough that we actually go into hypothermia, and severe hypothermia can result in chill coma, which is essentially what happened to Beck Weathers. He went into a short coma before he came back out of it again, induced by cold temperatures. So even excellent thermoregulators have thermal limits, and they have consequences. We think about human consequences. You think about heat waves in places like Europe. Those where heat waves are bad are directly correlated with incidences of death in those countries. They're a serious problem even for excellent thermoregulators. Bumblebees are excellent thermoregulators, but they face this same issue. And what we call these, rather than fever and hypothermia, we call the highest temperature an animal like a bumblebee can tolerate its critical thermal maximum, right? The maximum temperature it can tolerate before it essentially goes into a temperature-induced coma. And a critical thermal minimum is the lowest temperature it can tolerate, again, before it goes into that temperature-induced coma. Now, thermal minima, they can recover from. So you get them cold, they kind of pass out, go into coma, and then they wake back up if you warm them up again. So they're quite responsive to these, but still these are limits. So we started to get very interested in whether or not these thermal limits actually constrain where bumblebees can live. So this is a big group project with a bunch of folks in my lab and key collaborators at Alabama and also Ohio State. And we were working again with this species. And what we wanted to ask, again, the simple question, do these thermal limits that these animals have constrain where they live? So to address this question, we wanted to go out into the wild. And so this is California, Northern California and Oregon that I'm showing here. And what I'm showing with the points are places where we collected queen bumblebees. And these sites differ strikingly in the temperatures that animals that live there experience. So if I'm in a lowland place in Southern California, I tend to experience hot temperatures. That's indicated by the red line here. If I'm in a high altitude place in Northern Oregon, I tend to experience cold temperatures on average throughout the year. And that's what indicated in blue here. So these populations experience very different temperatures. And we wanted to ask whether or not that leads to differences in their critical thermal limits. And so to do that, we caught a bunch of queens, just like I showed you before, separate set of queens, brought them into the lab, reared up colonies from those queens, and then measured critical thermal limits of the workers of those colonies. Again, we're eliminating the potential developmental effects. This is really looking at local adaptation in these critical thermal limits. When we do that, we find some really interesting patterns. So what I'm going to show you here is this critical thermal minimum that I showed you. So this is the coldest temperature that these animals can tolerate. Below this temperature, they go into coma. Okay. And this is 3 different colonies that we measured from the South Lowland site, so our warmest site. And you can see when you get them down to about 0, these animals go into coma. Interestingly, if you go to our coldest sites up in high altitude Northern Oregon, what we find is that these animals, same species, just a different population, right? And reared in the same conditions in the lab. Again, the only thing that's different is their moms from these different places. They actually can maintain activity down to below -5, even down sometimes to -10 before they actually hit chill coma. So they have striking differences in cold tolerance. But interestingly, and this matches really well the temperatures of the places their moms came from. So this is the annual minimum temperature of where mom came from. And this is the cold tolerance of the workers, of the daughters of that queen. And what you see is this really nice relationship. If you're from a cold place, you have good cold tolerance. Conversely, heat tolerance is invariant. So across all of these sites, all of them fail right around 50 degrees, which is quite high 50 degrees C is warm, but this is the air temperature necessary to cause them to fail, and it leads to this high internal temperature. But again, I showed you they fly around at very high temperatures already, so this high CT max is probably related to that. So they have high heat tolerance. Cold tolerance varies with populations. So whether or not these temperature tolerances indicate where they can live, likely the cold tolerance may limit how high up mountains they can go. So I hope I've showed you that these bumblebees have these remarkable adaptations to allow it to thrive at these extreme conditions. But I don't want to give you the impression that bumblebees are just superheroes that are not responsive in terms of populations and numbers to conditions. So roughly 25% of the bumblebee species in the US are currently in decline or major trouble. So 25%, a quarter of all species. This is Franklin's bumblebee. This was a bumblebee that used to be super common in Western Oregon. It hasn't been seen in about 2 or 3 decades. So we think it's probably extinct at this point. This is Bombus affinis, or the rusty-patched bumblebee. Again, used to be one of the more common species found in the eastern US. It's essentially gone. It's found, 1 or 2 are found every year in a few local populations, but that's about it. This is an interesting parasitic bumblebee. So it actually goes into other bumblebees' nests, kills the queen, and then slaves her workers to rear its young. Kind of a crazy story. This species also used to be super common. Rarely find it anymore. Most recently, perhaps this is a species from Western US, from California. Really interesting animal. We rarely find it anymore. It used to be super abundant 10 years ago. This one might be familiar to you. This is the Western bumblebee, Bombus occidentalis. It's been in the news recently because it's been petitioned for listing. It used to be the most abundant bumblebee in the Pacific Northwest, Oregon, Seattle area. It's now not found there. You cannot find it there, but there are still populations in the Rocky Mountains, including here in Wyoming. And so a student at University of Wyoming, Christy Bell, working with Lusha Tronstad, is currently trying to figure out how stable these populations in Wyoming are and whether or not this is sort of a last stronghold for this Western bumblebee. I'm hopeful, but her current data is suggesting it probably isn't. They're also likely in decline here in Wyoming. We're just behind the curve in terms of the decline that happened in the Pacific Northwest. So I don't mean to put too negative a take on this, but the reality is that these things are going down, and they're going down fast. And there's diverse reasons for that. Pesticides are a big one. There's clear links between pesticide use and bumblebee declines. Pathogens are another key problem. They have critical pathogens that seem to be in high numbers, perhaps associated with pesticides and also climate. And then, of course, land use changes are huge. Converting what was previously wildflower-filled land with urban or other usage is taking away that habitat that they could use. You combine all these things together, these populations are in decline. And the last thing is climate. It's been shown very well in the last couple of years that there's strong correlations with declines in these animals and climate. So I want to come back to those data we have on physiology and ask, how might climate be related to declines of these bumblebees? And so I want to show you two graphs here. On the left, I just ignore the right for a second. On the left here, this is just showing for the period of 1960 to 1990, areas of the map. Again, this is Western US, sort of California into Oregon and Washington, areas of the map where temperature is above 36 degrees C. This corresponds nicely with when these animals, like we measured, hit that critical thermal maximum. They hit that top temperature they can handle. And the black outline here is the distribution, the current distribution of this species, where you find this species. And so you see pretty nice matching. Here's what's predicted to happen in 2100. So you see much of the range of this species is probably no longer hospitable, but more generally speaking, we expect sort of the southern range edge to move north to escape those hot temperatures. So you might say, well, they could just keep moving north and we'll just lose these bees to Canada, but at least they'll still be around. The problem is that because they also have a cold tolerance limit, so I just want you to focus on the dark blue. Dark blue here indicates areas where these bees fail due to their cold tolerance limit. Currently, the current distribution, and then where that goes in 100 years. So hopefully you see that cold tolerance limit does not move north. So unfortunately, we think these bees are probably trapped in what we're calling a climate vice. They're being forced northward by warming temperatures, but they can't move north on the north end because it's too cold. So eventually we're just going to squeeze out those populations if these trends continue. So I'm going to leave it at that. I hope that the next time you're running around in your garden or running around in the mountains, you see these animals and you think a little bit differently about them. They're pretty remarkable creatures. We still have a ton to learn. So I'm happy to answer any questions. I'm going to quickly acknowledge lots and lots of students, undergraduates and graduate students, postdoc, lots of colleagues, and then funding primarily from NSF for much of this work.
Michael, great. Love that story. Really neat set of studies that you pieced together to chip away at those different questions. Love it.
Thanks.
Let's see here. If we look in the chat box in the Q&A, if any questions come in.
Can I?
So again,
is it okay if I stop my share so I can see?
Sure, that's fine. Yeah, great.
Okay. Yeah, I can't see the Q&A. There we go.
There you go. So again, if you have questions for Michael, you can submit those in the Q&A box. And again, he can take a look at those.
I can, oh yeah, so the first question is, what is my main website? So I'll both say it and type it in here. It's dillonlab.org. So you can hopefully find more information, find primary literature if you'd like, and also feel free to, my email's on there too, so you can email me if you have other questions.
Perfect. I see Tamara Dunn, maybe you have your hand up. If there's a way you could submit a question through the Q&A box, that'd be great.
So we've got another one, Justin Anderton, most highly used social media platform. I am a Luddite in terms of social media. So I have Twitter and Instagram, but I don't use them. So the best way to get in touch with me and talk to me about this stuff is send me an email. I will respond. If the lifespan of bumblebees changing? This is another question. It's a really neat question. So my short answer is we don't know. We do know that there's strong variation between the castes of bees and their lifespan. So again, it's a social insect. So you have a queen, and then you have the workers that she produces. And at the end of the season and fall, she also produces new queens and males. So the males and queens mate, the males die. Those new queens then overwinter and then come out the next spring to start new colonies. So queen bumblebees live for more than a year. Worker bumblebees live for maybe 2 weeks in the wild, and males maybe about 2 to 3 weeks as well. We don't have a clear idea of whether or not those lifespans are changing in response to climates. We do have some idea that queen lifespans are in part related to the fact that they're underground overwintering for much of their life. So that may, in essence, sort of prolong their life. You could think of them having super low activity levels and metabolic rates, such that they're not kind of cycling through resources very quickly, so they may go for longer. So that may be shortened if our winter season gets shortened due to warming. So I don't know. It's a really interesting idea. I don't know enough about it. Let's see, a couple of questions in the chat. So what's next on the research front? So as I just alluded to, one of the things that we're really excited right now is thinking about that overwintering period. So I'm guilty, I think, like most biologists, of primarily focusing on our organisms during the growing season. Maybe that's because when we're not teaching, and also because when we can get out and do stuff. But so many organisms, most of their lifespan, including here in Wyoming, is winter. Right? So 9 months out of the year, these bees are underground, not doing anything as far as we know. We don't know what they're doing. And so our big push right now is trying to understand what's happening in winter to these queens, because we think it's fundamentally important to sort of address one of these other questions. How does that affect bumblebee populations, right? So those queens that go into underground in fall and overwinter are the sole source of the next year's population. That's it. All the eggs are in that basket. So it's not like honeybees that kind of live for multiple years and stuff and then kind of, That's it. And yet we know almost nothing about where they overwinter, how they accumulate fats so they can survive for 9 months, what things may kill them during winter, what things may result in them actually having some success when they come out in spring in terms of founding colonies and having a new colony that then is successful throughout the season. So that's one of the most exciting things that we're really thinking a lot about right now is what's going on in winter. What can we do to help bumblebee populations? Fortunately, there's a couple of really simple things you can do. One, in your own yard, if you can at all avoid it, don't use pesticides. Two, in your own yard, plant flowers that are blooming from as early in spring as possible, all through the summer to as late in fall as possible. We know that the presence of resources on the landscape is a really strong predictor of populations of these, of not only bumblebees, but all other native bees. And so those are simple things you can do to help. The other thing is in early spring, this may have happened to some of you. Maybe you're kind of cleaning up leaves in your yard. You're starting to turn over soil, thinking about planting stuff. You might come across queens. Do your best to cover them back up. When they're ready to come out and start nests, that's when they should come out. And we often see a lot of dead queens early in spring because they've come out too soon and they're just not ready to get moving. So there's some simple things you can do at your home to help out.
Michael, I've got a quick question for you to follow up on the overwintering.
Yeah.
So it was striking to see the queens that you brought into the lab and then see them creating the hives, because I don't know that you ever encounter that in nature, or you don't really stumble upon them much. So where do they nest, or where did they create those?
Yeah, so some of you may have come across them in weird places in your yards. So they will find any existing hole in the ground. So classically, old rodent burrows is kind of a common place to find them, but you'll find them in, let's say, bird nest boxes that you put out. Oftentimes they will go into wood piles and they'll find a nice cavity in a wood pile and they'll nest there. So anywhere kind of right at the ground surface or just underneath ground where they can find an existing cavity. They don't dig out their own cavity, they use existing ones. And so one behavior you might see in early spring is you might see queens and you'll see them kind of flying around close to the ground, usually over grassy areas. They're looking for holes in the ground to get into and check out whether or not it's a good place to put a nest. We get lots of calls here with people having found nests in their yards. And if they're in a bad place, we'll go kind of take them and bring them into the lab and take care of them because they'll end up under a step in somebody's house or, so. So
if you become good at recognizing those behaviors of where they're searching, can you now go and find nests fairly well in an area if you need to, or is that still pretty tough?
It's tough. Finding nests is tough. The best way that we've found to do it is follow workers back. Mm-hmm. And so you can go to a flower patch and then they generally have a behavior of sort of beelining back to the nest once they're done foraging. So when you see them beeline, you chase them for as long as you can until you lose them. Then you just stand and you wait. And you hope another one comes by and is on the same track and you chase them. And eventually you might find a spot where they're actually nesting. So we're not very good at it. And we're even worse at finding where they're overwintering. Mm-hmm. We have no way. I will mention one thing, and I'll actually put it in the chat, I guess. Another thing that you could do related to this is there's a group of us that have started an attempt to sort of crowdsource information about where queens are. And it's called queenquest.org, and you can go there. And it's really simple. If you're in your yard and you discover a bee that looks like it's overwintering, meaning it's just really slow and it's kind of a little bit under the soil surface, you record a few quick things about what you saw and where you found it, and you report that on there. And the idea is that hopefully we'll get people all over the country, and we've already got some of this, reporting on these things and gradually start to figure out patterns of where we might find these things. So I encourage you to check it out. It's pretty cool. And you can go look at the existing data and see what people have found.
Michael, can you add is there any kind of transmitter device that you can tag queens with to see where they're going?
We've thought about it. The problem is that a lot of these transmitters are still pretty big. So you can use harmonic radar. So you can use these little tiny ones, but you have to have a radar dish on the back of a truck to do it. They're so small that even the smallest ones we're worried are just going to affect their behavior. So we're hoping the technology gets to the point where we have, tiny, a bit like the GPS collars they put on ungulates that we could put on bees, but we don't have that yet. So it'd be really great to. I do see one question. Do you think that the weather change, like the snow in Texas, will hurt the bees? We actually did a study this fall. So backing up, people often think about climate change mostly in terms of these sort of mean changes over time, so 1 to 2 degree increase in mean temperatures over time. But more and more, we're realizing there's really more interesting things that are happening in terms of climate change that may have larger impacts on wildlife. And one of those is extremes, changes in extremes and changes in frequencies of extremes. And so it's a really interesting question because so in fall, back in September in Laramie, I'm not sure if you guys must have gotten this cold front too. Early September, it dropped like 35 degrees in 12 hours. And we knew that was coming. And so we set up an experiment with fall queens and males. And we basically put them out in these conditions in chambers where we could track what they did. And the question was simply, when you have these random weather fronts like this that last a few days, what's the impact on these animals? How do they deal with it? And what we found was really encouraging, I think. So males did not deal with it well. Most of the males that we put out could not figure out how to get out of the weather and they died. Queens, on the other hand, most of them managed to kind of bury themselves into the mulch. And out of 30 queens that we put out, only one of them died. And she was the only queen that unfortunately was sort of the last one to get into a hole. So there's a little pile of bees underneath the mulch. She was the last one in, and she probably froze because of the surface temperatures. And so queens seem to have a pretty good ability to respond to short-term weather changes and get into buffered places in microenvironments. So underground, out of the way, and deal with it. So temperatures here in our experiment got below 0, but none of those queens died, except for that one. So that's good news that maybe they can weather these weather fronts and be successful. In the spring, we do know that when we get those warm-ups in March, where we'll get like 3 or 4 days where it gets up in the 30s and 40s and it's sunny and the snow's melted, oftentimes we think that triggers a sort of false emergence of these queens. So they come out thinking, hey, it's spring. But of course, there's no resources in March. And so they come out and they die. Once they come out, they don't seem to be able to go back under. So it may be that periodic warm spells in spring may have really drastic consequences for these populations, given effects on queens at those times. The other question here is, how does drought affect bees? Bees as a group, native bees as a group are really interesting because native bee diversity, so this is beyond bumblebees, this is all the other bees as well. There's roughly 2,000 plus species of native bees in the US, and there's about 20,000 described species of bees in the world. So that's, if you added up all of the mammals and birds combined, it's still less than the number of native bee species in the world. Lots of species. They often, as a group, are often centered around sort of Mediterranean, drier climates. So bees as a group seem to do pretty well in dry places. The primary effects I would imagine for drought on bees would be indirect on their resources. So if you have periodic droughts that wipe out the floral resources that they depend on, then those bees aren't going to do well. So in places where you don't have plant populations that are adapted to those drought-like conditions and therefore continue flowering regardless, you could imagine that those resources go away, the bees can't make it anymore.
All right. Well, if you've got more questions, you could shoot them either directly to Michael or to myself, and I can forward them over. But at this point, let's thank him very much. Thanks, Michael, very much for visiting with us tonight, taking time to share the insights that you've accumulated over several years about these bees. Really neat.
Absolutely. I appreciate the invite. It's been fun. I wish I
Great.
could see everybody's faces, but
That's the strangest part for sure. Thanks so much, Michael.
Thank you.
Hey, have a good evening. We'll see you soon.
You too. Take care.